Before the world had a word for beauty, there was an act of violence so extreme it split the sky from the earth, and from the wound, from the sea foam that rose around the severed flesh of a god. Something stepped out of the water that the ancient Greeks had no word for either. Something new, something that made every god who witnessed it stop, fall silent, and feel a pull in the chest they had never felt before. That is where Aphrodite begins. Not in a golden cradle, not in a garden, not in the warm light of a loving parent's arms. She begins in the aftermath of a catastrophe that remade the cosmos. She steps out of the sea with salt in her hair, fully grown, impossibly beautiful, and accompanied by Eros and Himeros, desire and longing, as if those two forces had been waiting for her on the shore. Most people, when they think of the goddess of love, picture the painting, the shell, the soft skin. Botticelli's serene figure drifting toward the shore on a wave of Renaissance light. That painting is extraordinary, but it leaves something out. It smooths the violence from the beginning. It forgets the sickle. Tonight, that is where we start. With the sickle. Because here is the truth that the popular version of Aphrodite almost always skips. The most beautiful being in the history of Western mythology was born from one of the most brutal acts in all of ancient literature. And understanding that, really sitting with it, changes what the goddess of love actually is. By the end of this story, that phrase will mean something different than it does right now. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into whatever surface is holding you. There is no urgency here. The story that is about to unfold has been waiting 3,000 years. It can wait a few more moments while you settle in and breathe. The sea is patient. It always has been. Here is the first thing most retellings of Aphrodite leave out. She almost certainly was not originally a Greek goddess at all. There is a detail that classical scholars noticed in the 20th century, and that continues to shape how we understand her. Unlike most of the major Olympians, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Hermes, Apollo, Aphrodite's name does not appear in Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greek, the language of the civilization that preceded classical Greece by roughly 5 centuries. The Mycenaeans documented their gods carefully on clay tablets. Aphrodite is absent, which means that when Greek civilization rebuilt itself after the dark ages of the 12th century BCE, it picked up something from the civilizations to the east that it had not possessed before. That something had a different name, depending on where you were standing. In Sumer, in the 4th millennium BCE, she was called Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, goddess of love, war, sex, and political power. She was among the most complex deities in human religious history. Fierce, ambitious, deeply erotic, and capable of enormous destruction. Her myths, inscribed on clay tablets that predate the Iliad by roughly 2,000 years, follow a goddess who descends into the underworld, who loves a shepherd named Dumuzid, who mourns his death and whose grief defines the turning of the seasons. Remember that pattern. The beloved shepherd, the goddess's grief, the year divided between life and death, because it will surface again in a myth the Greeks told about Aphrodite and a mortal she loved. The same shape, the same sorrow, but 10 centuries and several civilizations older than the telling we usually encounter. The Akkadians and Babylonians knew the same goddess as Ishtar. The Phoenicians knew her as Astarte, and it was the Phoenicians who carried her worship westward across the Mediterranean, through their trading networks, through their colonies, most importantly, through the island of Cyprus. Cyprus is the key to understanding Aphrodite. It is the island the Greeks called her birthplace. It is where the most important sanctuary in her entire cult was built. And it was, in the 8th century BCE, during what scholars call the Orientalizing period, when archaic Greece was absorbing enormous amounts of Near Eastern culture, religion, and iconography. The crossroads where the Semitic goddess of the East and the emerging divine landscape of Greece began to become one being. The Getty Villa in Los Angeles has framed this history precisely. Cyprus was a crossroads of cultural interaction where traditions around a local fertility goddess were reshaped by encounters with Near Eastern deities. The nudity, the gesture of cupped hands at the breast, the dove, all of these symbols carried by Aphrodite's cult were already centuries old by the time any Greek poet wrote her name. She arrived in Greece carrying the accumulated weight of a tradition that stretched back to the earliest urban civilizations on Earth. When you picture her, you are not picturing a Greek invention. You are picturing the end point of a 4,000-year transmission, a goddess who began in Sumer, passed through Babylon and Phoenicia, touched down on Cyprus, and arrived in Greece wearing a name that Hesiod himself admitted was derived from a word for sea foam. Whether that derivation is correct, or whether the name is actually Semitic in origin, remains a matter of scholarly debate. But the foam story is the one that captured human imagination, and it is where the myth truly begins. Hesiod composed his Theogony somewhere around 700 BCE, and in it he told a story that had almost certainly been circulating in oral tradition for decades before he committed it to verse. The birth of Aphrodite begins not with her, but with her grandfather, if that word can even apply to a being as primordial as Uranus, the sky itself. Uranus, in Hesiod's telling, was not a good father. He feared his own children, the Cyclopes, the 100-handed giants, and refused to let them see the light, pressing them back into the body of their mother, Gaia, the earth. Gaia groaned under the weight of her imprisoned children for ages. Eventually she fashioned an adamantine sickle and asked her youngest Titan son, Cronus, to use it. Cronus agreed. He waited in ambush. When Uranus descended to lie with Gaia, when the sky came down to embrace the earth, as it did every night, Cronus reached up with his left hand and cut. The severed parts were flung into the sea. What happened next is described by Hesiod in some of the most vivid lines in Greek literature. As the drops of blood fell onto the land, they gave rise to the Erinyes, the Furies, beings of vengeance, as well as the giants and the Meliae, the nymphs of the ash tree. Violence had entered the world's fabric, and these were its children. But the severed flesh itself fell into the sea, and something different happened there. Hesiod writes, in Greek that is still, after 2,700 years, audibly beautiful, that the organs were carried over the sea for a long time. White foam arose from the immortal flesh, and within the foam, a maiden was nurtured. A white foam arose from the immortal flesh. With it, a girl grew. She drifted first to the island of Cythera, off the southern coast of the Peloponnese, then to Cyprus, whose shores became her home. When she stepped ashore, green grass grew up beneath her delicate feet. The Homeric tradition, preserved in the short hymn that runs alongside Hesiod's account, adds a welcoming party. The Horae, the goddesses of the seasons, who dressed her in gold, adorned her with flowers, and led her to the assembly of the gods. Every deity present fell silent. Every one of them felt the pull. Eros and Himeros, desire and longing, became her constant companions from that moment on, walking beside her everywhere she went, as if her very presence had summoned them into existence. Here is the twist in her story, the one that most retellings pass over as quickly as possible. The goddess of love, the being who would be named for the experience of beauty and longing and tenderness, does not come from warmth or from union. She comes from a wound. She comes from the aftermath of the most violent act in the cosmogony. and the Greek tradition preserved this fact. Hesiod does not soften it. He begins with the sickle, because the sickle is the beginning. Hesiod gave her 3 epithets in the birth passage alone. Cytherea, for the island she first touched, Cyprogenes, for Cyprus, and Philomedes, which Hesiod himself translated as genital-loving, because she came forth from the media, the genitals of Uranus. Later tradition smoothed this to smile-loving, and that translation held because Aphrodite was indeed a goddess famous for her smile. She is called laughter-loving Aphrodite throughout Homer. But Hesiod's darker etymology lingers, the smile and the origin. She cannot be separated from the act that created her. Keep that image, the white foam, the maiden in the sea, because we will return to it at the end of this story. It changes meaning by then. Now here is the thing that separates Hesiod's Aphrodite from the Aphrodite in Homer's Iliad. In the Iliad, probably composed alongside or even before the Theogony, in oral traditions that overlapped, Aphrodite is not a foam-born motherless goddess of ancient generation. She is the daughter of Zeus and an ancient goddess named Dione, an Oceanid in Hesiod's genealogy, something closer to a Titan in other sources, her precise lineage varying across the tradition. She has a mother. She has a father. She is wounded in battle by the Greek hero Diomedes. We will come back to that. And she runs to Zeus crying, and he takes her hand and says, gently but not entirely without amusement, that her domain is love, and she should leave war to Ares and Athena. The 2 accounts are so different that Plato, writing in his Symposium around 385 BCE, decided the only sensible solution was that they described 2 entirely different beings. He put this argument in the mouth of a speaker named Pausanias, who proposes that there are 2 Aphrodites. The elder one, Aphrodite Urania, the heavenly, was the daughter of Uranus alone, born without a mother, born from that act of cosmic violence in the sea. The younger, Aphrodite Pandemus, Aphrodite of all the people, was the daughter of Zeus and Dione. Pandemus was equated by Pausanias with sexual gratification and attraction towards the body of a lover, while Urania was associated with a nobler attraction to the mind and soul, born without the involvement of a woman. Scholars have noted, with some justification, that this is a philosopher imposing a neat hierarchy on a tradition that was never meant to be tidy. Christine Downing has pointed out that in actual cult practice, the categories were murkier. Urania was worshipped at sanctuaries that included courtesans, while Pandemos was the Aphrodite of civic unity and was regarded as entirely respectable. Plato's binary says more about Plato's preferences than about what the goddess actually meant to the people who worshipped her. And here is what that duality actually reveals about how the Greeks thought about love. The 2 versions of her birth exist side by side in the tradition because the Greeks preserved both simultaneously and did not consider them a contradiction. To them, Aphrodite was large enough to contain both. She was the primordial, motherless, sea-born force that predated the Olympian order. And she was also the familiar, family-embedded daughter of Zeus, a figure who could be comforted, who could bleed, who could be scolded. Both were true. Both were necessary. There is something else worth noting here, and it points towards something later in this story. The being who forced gods and mortals to fall in love against their better judgment, who made even Zeus stumble into mortal beds, had never herself been subject to the same force. She was, in the tradition, almost uniquely immune to the compulsion she imposed on everyone else. Keep that irony in mind. It comes back around. That is a more sophisticated theology than it first appears. On the southwestern coast of Cyprus, near a rocky outcropping, the Greeks called Petra tou Romiou, the rock of the Greek. The sea behaves strangely. The waves are larger. The foam is white and persistent. Ancient travelers noted it. It was here, they said, that Aphrodite first set foot on land. The sanctuary of Aphrodite Paphia at Paphos was built to mark this spot. The ruins of the sanctuary were added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1980 due to their historical religious significance. Archaeological evidence at the site dates back to the early 3rd millennium BCE, long before Homer, long before Hesiod, long before any Greek word was written down. The sanctuary was closed during the persecution of pagans in the late Roman Empire in the 4th century, having been in function for thousands of years since the late Bronze Age. A sanctuary in continuous use for over 3,000 years. There are not many places in the world that can claim that. Here is the detail that tends to stay with people when they learn it. In the innermost chamber of the sanctuary, where devotees would have expected to find a statue of the goddess, a beautiful sculpted body in marble, the kind that fills museums today, there was instead a black conical stone. Not anthropomorphic, not beautiful in any conventional sense. Scholars believe it may have been a meteorite. The worship of Aphrodite at the sanctuary of Paphia centered on this sacred conical stone, which served as the primary symbol of the goddess rather than an anthropomorphic statue. It received offerings of honey and milk, incense burned to create a fragrant altar, and non-bloody sacrifices, as blood was explicitly forbidden. Think about that for a moment. This is the goddess born from a wound that bled across the sky and into the sea, and her most ancient sanctuary forbade blood offerings. There is something in that reversal that feels deliberate, a place of peace built on the memory of violence. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world to walk the 60 stadia from the harbor to the sanctuary. The Aphrodisia festival was celebrated annually in midsummer across Greece, but most magnificently here, with processions, rituals, the sacrifice of doves, and the anointing of the sacred stone. Aphrodite's most prominent avian symbol was the dove, which was originally an important symbol of her Near Eastern precursor Inanna Ishtar. The ancient Greek word for dove, peristera, may be derived from the Semitic phrase pera Ishtar, meaning bird of Ishtar. Even the birds in her temple carried the memory of Babylon. Think about what it means that the only complete poem of Sappho's to survive is addressed directly to the goddess of love. Not to Zeus, not to Apollo, not to Athena. Aphrodite. 28 lines that endured 2.5 millennia, because a Roman critic named Dionysius of Halicarnassus quoted them in full in a treatise on literary style, which was then copied and copied again, and eventually survived into a world Sappho could not have imagined. The oldest complete female-authored lyric poem in the Western literary tradition, and it is a prayer. Sometime in the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, on the island of Lesbos, Sappho was probably writing this for performance within a thiasos, a religious community of women devoted to the goddess. She opens by calling her Pikilothron Athanat Aphrodita, iridescent-throned immortal Aphrodite. She begs the goddess not to crush her spirit with anguish and pain. She recalls a previous time when she called out and Aphrodite actually came, descended from Olympus in a chariot drawn by sparrows, landed in the mortal world, and spoke to Sappho directly. Smiled, asked what was wrong. The poem then conveys Aphrodite's response. Whom should I persuade now to love you? Who, Sappho, is doing you wrong? For if she runs now, soon she'll follow. And if she won't accept gifts, soon she'll give them. And if she doesn't love now, soon she'll love you, even reluctantly. There is something extraordinary in this. Sappho is presenting the goddess of love not as a distant cosmic force, but as a companion, warm, direct, even gently wry. Scholars have described the threefold repetition of what Aphrodite promises as having a cadence that is simultaneously reassuring and lightly teasing, as if the goddess has seen this situation many times before and finds the human heart's distress both genuine and, from her immortal perspective, entirely manageable. Sappho asks Aphrodite to be her Symmachos, her comrade in arms. This is a word used for military alliances between city-states. Sappho is treating the goddess of love as a partner in a mutual pact between intimates. This is not how most people picture the relationship between a mortal and an Olympian. But it may be how Aphrodite was actually experienced by the women who devoted themselves to her, not as the untouchable beauty on the pedestal, but as the friend who understood desire from the inside, because she was made of it. Because she had always been made of it from the first moment she stepped onto the shore. You know what it is to want someone to understand it from the inside rather than observe it from a careful distance. That is what Sappho was asking for. That is what the temple at Paphos was built for. Zeus had a complaint, and it was not unreasonable. For as long as anyone could remember, Aphrodite had been making gods fall in love with mortals. She had sent Zeus himself stumbling into mortal beds. She had caused the dawn goddess Eos to fall so completely for a mortal man named Tithonus that Eos asked Zeus to grant him immortality, and then, crucially, forgot to ask for eternal youth to go with it, which is a separate story and a terrible lesson about the specificity of divine requests. She had arranged divine unions all across the cosmos, always with complicated results, always watching from a safe distance, never subject to the same compulsion she imposed on everyone else. This is the irony that was pointed to earlier. The being who had made all other gods fall for mortals had never herself been made to feel that particular vulnerability. Zeus decided to change that. He placed in Aphrodite's heart a desire for Anchises, a mortal shepherd of surpassing beauty who tended cattle on the slopes of Mount Ida near Troy. The Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, composed sometime in the 7th century BCE and among the most sophisticated texts in the Greek religious tradition, narrates what happened next. Aphrodite went first, to her sanctuary at Paphos, and bathed, anointed with ambrosial oil by the Graces, then dressed herself in gold. She flew to Mount Ida. When she arrived, wild animals followed fawning behind her. Grey wolves, lions with fierce looks, bears and leopards. They went off in pairs to sleep in shaded nooks. She hadn't spoken yet, hadn't done anything visible. The animals simply recognized what she was. Picture that for a moment. The goddess walking up a mountainside, the predators going gentle, the world briefly reorganizing itself around her presence. She found Anchises alone, playing the lyre. She disguised herself as a mortal Phrygian princess. Anchises, half convinced she was divine, chose to proceed as though she was not. The hymn presents this as either willful suspension of disbelief or the effect of desire on cognition. As one scholar at the Center for Hellenic Studies has observed, these power games indicate that the gods are not omniscient and are subject to all too human emotions such as lust and anger. They lay together. Afterward, Aphrodite poured sleep over Anchises, dressed herself, and when he woke, she filled the full height of the room with her divine presence and told him the truth. Anchises was, understandably, terrified. She comforted him. She told him she would bear a son named Aeneas, a name derived, the hymn notes, with a folk etymology from the word ainos, meaning something close to awesome or terrible, because she felt grief and shame at having lain with a mortal. She gave instructions. The child would be raised by mountain nymphs, and when he was 5, she would bring him to his father. And Anchises must never tell anyone that the child's mother was a goddess, or Zeus would strike him with a thunderbolt. According to later tradition, Anchises told anyway, at a drinking party more than once, and was struck lame or blind. Sources differ. What is consistent is that the night on Mount Ida cost him something. Their son, Aeneas, survived. He fought in the Trojan War. When Troy fell, he escaped, carrying his father on his back, carrying the household gods in his hands, leading his small son by the hand through the burning city. He sailed west. His descendants, the Romans would eventually claim, founded Rome. The goddess of love's one moment of humiliation seeded an empire. Here is what the sources agree on regarding Aphrodite's marriage. Zeus arranged it. He gave the goddess of love and beauty to Hephaestus, the god of the forge, the smith, the craftsman, the limping god whom his own mother threw off Olympus when he was born because he was misshapen. Whether Hera threw him because he was ugly, or whether he became lame from the fall, depends on which source you read. Either way, Hephaestus was the most practical, the most grounded, the most physically imperfect of the Olympians. And Zeus married him to the most beautiful being who had ever existed. There is no surviving text that tells us why. The union was almost universally portrayed as a mismatch, and the divine community seems to have regarded it as such from the beginning. Aphrodite did not wait long. She began an affair with Ares, the god of war, the most beautiful of the male Olympians, the one least like her husband and most like the violent world she had been born from. Beauty and war, love and combat. It keeps coming back to the same pairing. Helios, the sun god, saw them together from his daily journey across the sky and reported it to Hephaestus. What happened next is preserved in Book 8 of Homer's Odyssey, sung by the blind bard Demodocus at the court of King Alcinous, and it is one of the oldest comic set pieces in literary history. Hephaestus went to his forge. He built a net of chains so fine as spiders' webs, the text says, that no one, not even a god, could see them. He draped this invisible net over the marriage bed. Then he announced loudly that he was going on a trip to Lemnos. Ares had been watching. The moment Hephaestus was gone, he went to the house. He took Aphrodite by the hand and said, "Come, love, let us to bed and take our joy. Hephaestus has left, for Lemnos no doubt." The net fell. Hephaestus returned before ever reaching Lemnos. Helios had kept watch and carried the word, and came home troubled in mind. And as he stood in the gateway, a terrible anger seized him. He cried out to all the gods, "Come, see something laughable and intolerable, how Aphrodite, daughter of Zeus, scorns me for my lameness." The male gods came. The goddesses, Homer notes, were too embarrassed to attend. And the gods who gathered, Poseidon, Apollo, Hermes, looked at the tangled, furious, helpless pair on the bed and began to laugh. Irrepressibly, the text says. The laughter pealed out. Apollo asked Hermes if he would trade places with Ares, chains, audience, and all, for a night beside golden Aphrodite. Hermes said yes, immediately, without hesitation. More laughter. Poseidon eventually negotiated the release. Ares fled to Thrace. Aphrodite fled to Paphos, where the Graces bathed her and dressed her in fresh clothes, returning her, the text says, to her pristine beauty, as if the whole humiliation simply washed off her in her sanctuary's water. The story is funny. It is also, when you sit with it, profoundly honest about what love actually does to people, divine or mortal. Desire overrides caution, overrides marriage contracts, overrides even the knowledge that a trap has been set. And the love and the war are not opposites in this story. They were together from the beginning, in the sea, in the blood, in the foam. The pairing of Aphrodite and Ares is not an accident in Greek mythology. it is a statement. The story of Adonis begins, as so many of the darker Greek myths do, with a goddess who has been disrespected. Aphrodite, according to Ovid's Metamorphoses, caused a woman named Myrrha, or Smyrna, depending on the source, to fall in love with her own father, King Cinyras of Cyprus. The offense that prompted this: Myrrha's mother had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than Aphrodite. The punishment for that kind of comparison was never mild. Myrrha's story is terrible, and we do not need to dwell in it. What matters is that after the tragedy ran its course, she was transformed into a myrrh tree. Inside the tree, a child was growing. When the tree cracked open, the child fell into the world. He was Adonis, and Aphrodite, walking by at that moment, looked at his face and was lost. She hid him in a chest and gave the chest to Persephone, queen of the underworld, for safekeeping. She did not explain what was inside. Persephone opened the chest, looked at the baby's face, and understood immediately why she had been given nothing but instructions not to look. By the time Aphrodite came back for the child, Persephone refused to return him. Zeus had to intervene. Their agreement he brokered, in different versions attributed to either Zeus himself or the muse Calliope, divided the year. 1/3 with Persephone in the underworld, 1/3 with Aphrodite above it, 1/3 for Adonis himself to choose. He chose every year to give his free third to Aphrodite, 2/3 of the year above, 1/3 below. Here is the pattern that was mentioned at the beginning of this story. In that detail about Inanna and Dumuzid, the shepherd god who descended into the underworld and whose return marked the spring. This is that same shape, here in Greek. The myth of Aphrodite and Adonis is now widely recognized by scholars as derived from the ancient Sumerian legend of Inanna and Dumuzid. The Greek name Adonis comes from the Canaanite word for lord. He is a foreign figure, absorbed into the Greek tradition, carrying a myth that was already old when the earliest Greek alphabetic inscriptions were being scratched into clay. The Adonia festival, in which Greek women would plant fast-growing seeds in small pots on their rooftops, watch them sprout and wither in the summer heat, and then mourn in public, is one of the oldest and most viscerally emotional festivals in the ancient world. Sappho, in the 6th century BCE, was already writing about it. Adonis died, as he always did. He ignored Aphrodite's warning not to hunt boars. Some say Ares sent the boar, jealous. Some say Artemis. Some say it was simply his own recklessness. The boar found him. He bled to death in Aphrodite's arms. From where his blood fell, the anemone flower grew, thin-petaled, easily torn by wind. The Greeks knew what flowers meant. He was not simply a lover. He was a dying and rising god, a stand-in for the agricultural cycle, for the crops that die in winter and return in spring. Aphrodite's grief was not personal tragedy alone. It was the force that pulled life back up through the soil. Love, in this telling, is not just a feeling. It is the mechanism of biological renewal. It is why anything grows. The story begins not with a goddess, but with one who was left out. Eris, Discord, was not invited to the wedding of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. She arrived anyway, and she brought a golden apple inscribed with one word, Callisti, to the fairest. She threw it into the gathering and left. 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, Athena, Aphrodite. Zeus, who had learned something from his years of experience with divine quarrels, declined to judge and assigned the task to a mortal. Paris, a prince of Troy raised as a shepherd on Mount Ida, known for making impartial decisions. Each goddess offered a bribe. Hera offered sovereignty over Europe and Asia. Athena offered wisdom and skill in war. Aphrodite offered the most beautiful mortal woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite. And the most beautiful mortal woman in the world was Helen, who was already married to the king of Sparta. What followed? The sailing, the abduction, the fleet of ships, the 10 years of war, the fall of Troy, is Homer's Iliad. And it was set in motion by a beauty contest on a hillside, judged by a shepherd who chose love over power and wisdom. In the Iliad itself, the brief allusion to this judgment shows that the episode was already familiar to Homer's audience. It is assumed knowledge, the backstory behind every divine grudge that drives the epic. In that same epic, Aphrodite is not an observer. She protects Paris when Menelaus is about to kill him in single combat, whisking him away in a cloud to his own bedroom. She is wounded. The Greek hero Diomedes, guided by Athena, strikes her in the wrist with his spear as she tries to rescue her son Aeneas from the field. She cries out. She bleeds ichor and flees to Olympus, shaking. Zeus smiles and says gently that she should leave war to Ares. The goddess of love bleeds on a battlefield. That is one of the most quietly remarkable moments in the Iliad, and it tends to pass in translation without the weight it deserves. The most powerful erotic force in the cosmos, whose beauty remade the political map of the ancient world, who was born from a wound in the sky, is herself wounded by a man. The circle that began with a sickle ends with a spear. Violence and beauty, always circling back. But before we leave her, there is something worth knowing about the name itself, because what Hesiod told you it meant may not be the whole story. Hesiod told you that her name meant foam. Aphros, sea foam. Aphrodite, foam born. And for 2,700 years, that is what most people have believed. Modern scholars are less certain. The word Aphros does appear in Greek, and the folk etymology is plausible on its surface. But several linguists and classicists have noted that the name Aphrodite does not behave the way a natural Greek compound word should. Its structure is unusual for Greek word formation. Some researchers have proposed that the name is Semitic in origin, derived from an ancient Near Eastern root associated with the goddess Astarte, or her cognates, and was later reinterpreted by Greek speakers as meaning foam-born, because the sound suggested it, not because that was the original meaning. The debate is unresolved. What it suggests is something worth pausing on. The Greeks received this goddess with a name they did not fully understand, and they told a story to explain it. The story became the myth. The myth became the truth. Then there is the double meaning Hesiod embedded in the birth passage. He writes that Aphrodite earned the epithet Philomedes because of her origins. But Hesiod's own text interprets it as deriving from medea, genitals, not from medio, to smile. The two words sound similar. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Hesiod was being deliberately ambiguous, encoding a dark reminder of her origins inside the charming epithet, or whether he simply noted two distinct names that happened to sound alike. The epithet most people remember, though, is the one Homer uses throughout both epics, laughter-loving Aphrodite. It appears dozens of times. Whatever else she is, she smiles. She does not demand fear, exactly. She demands attention. She demands acknowledgement. Her other epithets map an entire theology of love. Think of what it means that one goddess carried all of these simultaneously. Urania, heavenly. Pandemos, of all the people. Paphia, of Paphos. Cytherea, of Cythera. Anadyomene, she who rises from the sea. Areia, warlike, used in Sparta, where she was depicted bearing arms. Pontia, of the open sea, Apotrophia, the expeller, who drove sinful desire from the hearts of men. She was enormous, far larger than the image of the naked goddess on the shell. She was also, very practically, the root of a word still in daily use in every modern language: aphrodisiac. The chemicals that move desire through the human body still carry her name. The thing she was made of outlasted every temple, every inscription, every coin. Around 350 BCE, the Athenian sculptor Praxiteles carved a figure of Aphrodite for the city of Cnidus, the first large-scale female nude in the history of Western art. The Cnaidians became so famous for their statue that tourists came from across the ancient world simply to stand in front of it. A Bithynian king offered to pay off the entire public debt of the city in exchange for the sculpture. The Cnidians refused. Some things, they said, were not for sale at any price. That refusal tells you something about what she had become. Not just a goddess, but an image so irreplaceable that a city chose poverty over its loss. The ancient Greek painter Apelles, working in that same 4th century BCE, considered by Pliny the Elder to be the greatest painter who ever lived, made a painting called the Aphrodite Anadyomene, Venus rising from the sea, was brought to Rome and housed in a temple by Augustus. Then it was lost. All that remains of it is Pliny's description: a goddess wringing seawater from her hair as she emerges from the waves. 15 centuries later, in the mid-1480s, in Florence, a painter named Sandro Botticelli put down on a large canvas in tempera a woman standing on a scallop shell, blown toward the shore by the west wind Zephyrus, about to be caught in the arms of spring. It was something genuinely new. Having a large standing female nude as the central focus was unprecedented in post-classical Western painting, and certainly drew on classical sculptures coming to light in Rome, where Botticelli had spent time working on the Sistine Chapel. Scholars now believe the painting was almost certainly inspired by Pliny's description of Apelles' lost work. Botticelli understood himself as completing a task begun 15 centuries earlier. Botticelli was working under the patronage of the Medici family in a Florence absorbed by Neoplatonism. The attempt, led by scholars like Marsilio Ficino, to reconcile classical mythology with Christian theology. In this framework, Venus rising from the sea was a symbol of divine beauty descending into the material world. The heavenly love, Urania, made briefly visible in flesh and light. The figure at the center of Botticelli's painting is believed by many to be modeled on Simonetta Vespucci, a Florentine woman of legendary beauty who died of tuberculosis at 23. Botticelli himself may have loved her. He was buried, at his own request, at her feet in the church of Ognissanti. The goddess born from a catastrophe became the face of a dead 23-year-old girl. Beauty remains inseparable from loss. It always has been. Step back now from the individual myths, from the foam, the sickle, the apple, the net, the anemone. Step back and ask the question the ancient Greeks were asking every time they built a temple to her, every time they laid honey on the black stone at Paphos. What is she exactly? The Roman poet Lucretius, writing in the 1st century BCE, addressed his entire philosophical poem, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, to Venus. He called her Genetrix, the creator. Not merely the goddess of love, but the force of generation itself, the biological impulse that moves all living things toward each other, toward reproduction, toward the continuation of life. Without her, he wrote, nothing comes up into the bright shores of light. Without her, nothing is glad and lovable. This is the deepest interpretation. Aphrodite is not just desire between persons. She is the reason anything is born, the force that makes the deer seek each other in autumn, the force that makes the anemone open toward the light, the force that makes humans, in the middle of their ordinary difficult lives, look at another person and feel the world tilt. That force was born from violence. The Greeks never forgot this. They told the story at the beginning of every cosmogony. Here is where the sky was separated from the earth by an act of mutilation, and here, in the wound's aftermath, is where beauty came from. This is not a comforting story. It is an honest one. It says that love is not separate from the pain and chaos of existence. It does not come from the clean, the ordered, the arranged. It comes from rupture, from something broken and cast into the sea, from the foam that rise at the edges of wounds and the long drift through dark water, and the moment when something unexpected steps out of it onto a shore that was not expecting her, and the grass grows under her feet, and nothing is ever the same. The paradox never resolves. It is not meant to. The ancient Greeks did not want it to resolve. They built sanctuaries to its two-sidedness, worshipped both the heavenly and the earthly version, celebrated the smile and the sorrow, the gold and the ichor, the beauty and the wound. That made it. Aphrodite is not a goddess to be understood. She is a goddess to be encountered. The story has settled now, not concluded. Stories like this one don't conclude. They move back into the dark the way the sea moves back from the shore, quietly, and with everything it brought still present somewhere in the ground. Somewhere off the coast of Cyprus, the sea is still doing what it has always done. The rock of the Greek, the white foam, the shore where a goddess stepped and the grass grew beneath her feet without being asked. This is the moment I was pointing toward, back at the beginning, when the image of the foam and the maiden in the sea was set aside to be returned to later. Here it is. You began this story with a catastrophe, with a sickle, with blood and severed flesh cast into the dark water. And here, at the end, is what the sea made of it. Something stepped out of that foam onto a shore in Cyprus and changed everything in the world. The violence and the beauty were never separate things. They were one event seen from two angles. The most beautiful thing ever born came from the most violent act in the history of the cosmos. Not a contradiction. An honest description of how much of what matters in the world actually arrives, not through comfort and arrangement, but through the unexpected aftermath of something difficult, something broken, something cast into the sea. Let that settle now. If this story found you at a good moment, if something in it opened a question, or settled one, or simply kept you company through the last hour before sleep, consider subscribing to Sleepable Mythology. There are more of these waiting. More gods and more questions and more truths that outlasted the civilizations that first told them. Next, Persephone, the goddess who refused to return Adonis, who rules a kingdom no one enters willingly, and whose grief for what was taken from her is the reason anything ever grows again. Her story is already moving in the dark beneath this one. It has been the whole time. Good night.